With the NBA trade deadline less than 2 weeks away, could the Boston Celtics be looking to make some additional bench help for this roster? We got this article from Bleacher Report that we're going to be discussing, looking at 3 Celtics trade targets that they could look and acquire before the trade deadline. We'll look at how impactful those guys could be for the Boston Celtics and if they'd be the right fits for the Celtics. All of that and more on this episode of Celtics Digest. I'm Bruce Veliz. But before we dive into that Boston Celtics content and coverage, I would like to say that roughly 79.6% of our viewers are not subscribed. I would greatly appreciate it if you guys hit that big old red subscribe button and join the Celtics Digest family. We just recently hit 3,000 subscribers and we're on our new way to get to our goal of 4,000 subscribers. So if you want to make sure you stay up to date on daily Boston Celtics news, content, coverage, hit that subscribe button as you definitely will not regret it. But let's dive in at the news at today, looking at these 3 possible Celtics trade targets. Make sure to grab a snack as today's episode is going to be jam-packed. But like I just mentioned, 3 Celtics potential trade targets is going to be the topic of today's video. And we're going to be looking at some guys that, could fit in with the Grant Williams TPE, some that could not, and we'll be exploring why they would be a good fit for the Boston Celtics. So first, this article was produced by Zach Buckley. We've broken down a couple of his from Bleacher Report. Some good players that the Celtics should go after, some players that the Celtics aren't realistically wanting to go after. But he came up with 3 more targets the Celtics need to go after ahead of the trade deadline. If you want to look, he said that the Boston Celtics 3 trade targets are Cedi Osman from the San Antonio Spurs, Naji Marshall from the New Orleans Pelicans, and John Konchar from the Memphis Grizzlies. And if we want to keep diving in on this, he says, there's a decent chance Boston stands pat this trade season, as it may not have the budget to net anyone capable of cracking the playoff rotation. If the Celtics can work around this obstacle, though, they wouldn't mind adding another big wing, President of Basketball Operations Brad Stevens told reporters. Osman's value hovers near the high end of Boston's price range, but if the Shamrocks could afford him, he might actually find his way into postseason minutes. He's a jack of all trades, skill set seems to be tailor-made for a glue guy role on a good team, and while his arrival may not produce a major impact in any single area, he can make subtle contributions across the board. Naji Marshall and John Konchar are lower on the wish list with less in their offensive arsenals, but they're both steady team defenders who play with lots of energy and occasionally heat up from long distance. So when discussing these guys, obviously these 3 targets have been mentioned in the past. Bobby Marks came up with a video not too long ago, I believe it was last week, going over some Celtics trade targets. He mentioned John Konchar, he mentioned Naji Marshall. We've seen Cedi Osman thrown around. So we're going to be breaking down how likely it is that any of these guys land with the Boston Celtics and how impactful their role could be with this team. And the first one we're going to be discussing is Cedi Osman. Now, Cedi Osman is a small forward for the San Antonio Spurs who was acquired in a sign-and-trade deal this offseason for Max Strus from the Cleveland Cavaliers in a 3-team deal. He averages around 7.1 points, 2.6 total rebounds, and 1.8 assists on this San Antonio Spurs team, shooting around 48% from the field, 36% from 3, and 67% from the free throw. The only problem with the Boston Celtics going out and acquiring Cedi Osman is he does not fit into the Grant Williams TPE. He makes around $6.7 million this year, where the Grant Williams TPE is capped off at $6.25 million. Therefore, the Boston Celtics would not be able to acquire him via the traded player exception. They would have to move some contracts around, trade some of their lower-end guys, maybe a Stevens, maybe a Brissett, maybe a Mihailuk to go after and get him, throw some lottery picks or some second-round picks to get a guy like Cedi Osman, and I don't think that's really necessary. Like the article said, he's kind of a glue guy, isn't a jack of all trades, is going to be a great filler for this role piece on the bench. But the Celtics kind of already have that guy in the system that they've already been kind of building up, and that is Oshae Brissett. We've seen in recent games Oshae Brissett be that high-energy guy, and he does a lot of things. He can stretch out and shoot the 3 if he's efficient. Most of the times he's not, but sometimes he can be. He's a great energy rebounding guy. He can make some passes to make assists, and he can attack the rim as well, getting some putback plays. Honestly, I really like what Oshae Brissett brings for the Celtics team, and a guy like Cedi Osman is very similar to Oshae Brissett on a much bigger contract. Therefore, I don't think it's really necessary for the Boston Celtics to look out and go after a guy like Cedi Osman, to be honest, because I think we already have a guy very similar to him on a cheaper deal in Oshae Brissett. The next guy that we're going to be talking about is John Konchar. We've mentioned John Konchar plenty on this channel. He has averaging 3.6 points, 4 total rebounds, and 1.6 assists off of 41% shooting from the field, 30% from 3, and 75% from the free throw. Now, John Conchar was John Conchar was a guy who was, slotted into this Memphis Grizzlies end of their bench towards the start of the season, and with them having so many injuries in their guard position, a lot of people were questioning why John Conchar wasn't getting any minutes and if he would be explored and being moved off of, as he was, a big kind of nice vital piece on their defensive side for some of their playoff runs. That's why they extended him. But unfortunately for John Conchar, some guys on the offensive side have just overplayed him in this role, and he now is starting with this Memphis Grizzlies team as they had a plethora of injuries with John Morant, Steven Adams going down, Desmond Bane. They are, down to their G League guys playing for their main roster. So a guy like John Conchar might not be movable for the Memphis Grizzlies as they kind of need the roster spots, but also he isn't really that big of a needle mover for the Boston Celtics. He's a good defensive guard, but did the Celtics realistically really need that if they already have great defensive guards in Derrick White and Jrue Holiday? Not really, and that his shooting isn't the greatest as well. So I don't think the Boston Celtics should be realistically going after and trying to acquire a guy in John Conchar. Like Keith Smith has already said, and I proclaimed this from him before, if the Celtics wanted to go after John Conchar, they most likely probably would have already. They felt that, he fits into the Grant Williams TPE at $5 million. They'd be able to snag him up, and probably sending a second-round pick for him would be just the duty from Memphis, because Memphis is probably looking to move off of him. He doesn't get a lot of shots. He's at the end of their rotation. But like I mentioned, since they've had a lot of injuries this season, they might be not looking to move off of a guy just for a second-round pick, and they might just want to keep that body to make sure that they have enough players to play in the night. Personally, not really the biggest fan of John Conchar, but the guy that I am the biggest fan of out of this list is a guy in Naji Marshall. Now, Naji Marshall plays on the New Orleans Pelicans, which is a nice, young, promising team in the Western Conference. He's averaging around 7.5 points, 3.4 total rebounds, and 1.9 assists. Shooting around 44% from the field, 37% from three, and 78% from the free throw. Now, Naji Marshall is also a guy that Bobby Marks brought up in his trade update for the Boston Celtics, and he said that Naji Marshall is obviously a great defensive piece for the Boston Celtics and could be a great defensive power forward. Ultimately, though, the one problem about getting him is he's on a rookie deal, and he is a big part of this New Orleans Pelicans roster. He does play in some aspects, and even though they do have a loaded front court, thinking of guys in Jonas Valanciunas, Zion Williamson, Larry Nance, and now Naji Marshall, they could be looking to move off of one of those guys, potentially just because they moved off of a guy in Kira Lewis who was kind of slotted towards the end of their rotation. The only thing is Naji Marshall does get a decent amount of minutes for the New Orleans Pelicans, so it would be a little bit difficult to be able to acquire him. I think he is the best option for the Boston Celtics to acquire, as they can use the Grant Williams TPE in it, maybe throw a first because we have those protected for the future, or a couple seconds to land a guy in Naji Marshall. And Naji Marshall could be a great power forward center for the future. Like I mentioned, he's on a rookie deal. He could play on that rookie deal for the Boston Celtics on this TPE. And then in the future, when guys like Al Horford get a little bit older, or a guy like or we don't know who's going to be the backup center at this point with Luke Kornet and Neemias fighting over it, Naji Marshall kind of joins into that column and deserves a fighting chance. If he outperforms those guys, we had him as a sneaky trade. We brought him in, and he developed as a great piece, and he could be, one of those replacements for one of those guys as they get older. Ultimately, I think all of these guys have a, decent trade market. I think John Conchar is probably the least common that I think the Boston Celtics should go after, personally, as I just don't think his needs necessarily add to the Boston Celtics. I think a guy in Cedi Osman would be all right for the Boston Celtics, but we have a guy in Oshae Brissett already that could be him, and he's on a cheaper deal, and the Celtics would not be able to acquire Cedi Osman without trading for contracts. They would not be able to do it with the Grant Williams TPE. But a guy like Naji Marshall, I think, is the best fit for the Boston Celtics if they're looking to make a move. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below, as I love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions. Who do you guys like out of these three guys for the Boston Celtics to acquire? And if not, you don't like any of these guys, who do you want to see the Boston Celtics go out and get? Like I want to mention, the Celtics can go out and trade for guys that are equitable to their contracts. They're not going to be able to go out and get a guy that's worth more than $10 or $15 million, and they're not able to acquire one of those guys on the buyout market as well. They can only acquire guys under the 12.4 non-tax mid-level exception for the buyout. So the Celtics are very limited in making additions, but let's see if they do that, or will they stand pat. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Celtics Digest. If you guys are still not subscribed at this point of the video, what are you guys doing? Hit that subscribe button, as we know you enjoyed the content. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.